Locomotive number 1 is a 042 Stephenson type steam locomotive. It hauled the first passenger train in New South Wales, Australia. It was built by Robert Stephenson and Company in 1854. In 1846, the Sydney Railway Company was formed with the objective of building a railway line between Sydney and Parramatta. Number 1 was one of 4 locomotives that arrived by sea from the manufacturer in January 1855. The first passenger train hauled by Number 1 was a special service from Sydney Station to Long Cove Viaduct, near the present site of Lewisham, on the 24th of May, 1855, Queen Victoria's birthday. A common misconception is that locomotive number 1 hauled the first train at the grand opening of the first New South Wales Railway on the 26th of September, 1855. In fact, number 1 was in need of maintenance that day and not in steam. Its identical sister locomotive number 3 worked the first passenger train from Sydney at 9 a.m. and this was followed by the official train at 12 o'clock noon hauled by number 2, driven by William Sixsmith and fireman William Webster. Locomotive number 1 is currently restored as a static display at the Powerhouse Museum in Harris Street, Sydney, and has been part of the collection since the 8th of May, 1884.
Number 18 was the second of the E17 Class 060 freight locomotives, built in 1866 by Robert Stephenson and Co. in Newcastle as their builder's number 1542. The E17 class were examples of the classic Stephenson long boiler 060 design, which achieved significant increases in boiler efficiency and haulage capacity via deep firebox which hung after the rear driving axle. The E17 class ultimately numbered 23 locomotives supplied by several builders, and pioneered a successful family of NSW GR060 locomotives of the E17, I48, O60, and A93 classes. The E17 class were allocated to freight duties on the newly opened and heavily graded main lines to the south and west of Sydney, including operations over the Great Western Railway and Lithgow Zigzag, and the Great Southern Railway through Picton and Thirlmere to Goulburn. E18 was withdrawn by the NSW Railways as early as 1897. It was sold to the Southern Coal Company, which became the Corrimal Coal and Coke Company, and worked for them for many years, apparently being taken out of service in 1953. Fortunately, it was still in existence when the NSW RTM came into being in the early 1960s, and was obtained as a key exhibit in the formative days of that museum's collection. It was restored and placed on display at the Enfield Roundhouse site, and transferred to Thirlmere together with other exhibits in 1975. E18 retained some interesting features of early locomotives such as Salter safety valves. The large sandboxes on the front running plate attest to heavy freight train duties on the 133 grades and sharp curves of the early main line alignments, together with the need to counterweight the firebox. Number 18 is currently restored as a static display at the New South Wales Rail Transport Museum located at 10 Barber Road, Thirlmere, New South Wales 2572.
The NSW Railways started in 1855 with 4 members of the Class 1042 locomotives, and similar locomotives of Class 5, Class 1N and M, 36, followed. In 1874 the NSW Railways received replacement frames from Robert Stephenson and Co. with the intention of rebuilding the original Class 1 locomotives numbers 1 through 4. 4 members of the M, 36, Class 042 locomotives had also been in service since 1871, and an administrative decision led to the replacement frames being used to construct 4 new M, 36, class locomotives rather than rebuilding the aging 1-class engines. Accordingly, locomotives 1 to 4 were retired and their tenders rebuilt for use with the new locomotives. The 8 members of the M, 36, class were used for Sydney suburban passenger trains, much as the Class 1 engines had been from the opening of the original Sydney-Parramatta Railway. Eventually they were displaced by more modern and numerous locomotives classes. M78 was obsolete by 1896 when sold to a contractor for railway construction work. It later worked for the Public Works Department on projects including the Dorrigo branch construction. Number 78 began its preservation career when plinthed at the Enfield Locomotive Depot in 1928, paired with a redundant Z24 class tender rather than a more appropriate older model. It moved into the roundhouse for display with other NSW RTM exhibits by 1973, but after many years of exposure to the elements, Number 78 had become quite weathered. Number 78 was again plinthed in the NSW RTM grounds when the collection moved to Thirlmere in 1975. Number 78 was moved into the exhibit shed and a thorough static restoration undertaken during the 1980s, which has resulted in a much improved outlook for this historic engine. A suitable tender frame of 1860s vintage was retrieved from use as a weed-killing vehicle on the private South Maitland Railway, and around 1983 a replica tender tank was constructed to complete an historically correct tender configuration for display with number 78. Today number 78 has a prominent position at the entrance to the New South Wales Rail Transport Museum exhibit hall, and provides an interesting link to the early 042 locomotives of New South Wales.
Next up is number 79. Public Works Department, PWD, number 79 was built by Hunslet Engine Company of Leeds to one of their standard designs for 060 ST saddle tank industrial shunting locomotives. This locomotive spent its working life shunting the wharves and sidings of Port Kembla, and came into the possession of the New South Wales Government Railways when the PWD's railway operations were taken over in 1949. PWD number 79 was saved from the Enfield scrap roads for addition to the NSW RTM collection in the locomotive roundhouse at Enfield. It was transferred to Thirlmere together with other NSW RTM exhibits in 1975 and has been lovingly restored for static display by volunteers of the New South Wales Rail Transport Museum's Illawarra division. A number of similar Hunslet locomotives are also preserved in the United Kingdom.
Number 128 was one of an order of 3060 SD locomotives built for the New South Wales Government Railways by Vulcan Foundry of Newton-le-Willows, Lancashire. These locomotives were used for a variety of branch line duties including the Richmond and Camden lines. These three locomotives were later grouped with some similar locomotives to form the P127 class. P128 was allocated to the Yass Tramway from 1892 to 1910 and would have made many return trips on the short branch from the main line at Yass Junction to Yass Township. P128 was then sold to the Commonwealth Government and used in the construction of the Jarvis Bay Breakwater. P128 was later sold to Colingo Colliery in Cessnock but was set aside by 1938. At some stage it attracted the attention of scrap metal collectors and the saddle tank and boiler were cut apart, presumably to access the copper firebox and tubes, leaving the remaining frames, wheels, and smokebox languishing at Colingo. During the early preservation era these remnants were expected to be scrapped and thus various components such as the side rods and brake rigging were removed and are apparently now stored with the DSR&M collection at Dorigo. The remnants of P128 were retrieved from Colingo Colliery in 1983 and initially displayed at the Richmond Vale Railway Museum. P128 moved to the Yass Railway Museum in 1992. As an unlikely coincidence, the boiler of sister loco P129 was later discovered to survive at a sawmill. The sawmill operator apparently purchased P129 from Mount Kira Colliery in 1950s and, as only the boiler was needed, the rest of P129 was left for scrap. This boiler was purchased and transported to Yass in April 2000 and subsequently fitted to P128. Hopefully in the future a replacement saddle tank and cab roof could be manufactured, and the various smaller components in the DSR&M collection refitted, at which point P128 could be presented as a reasonably complete exhibit and interesting and historic survivor of early NSWGR branchline power. Currently remains in unrested condition at YSS Railway Museum in New South Wales located at 3 Crago Street, Yass, New South Wales 2582. Next up is 20N. 20N was built by Kitson and Company in Leeds for use of the contractor building the Windgen Murrurundi section of the Northern Railway. In 1872 the locomotive was sold to the NSW Railways for use on the Northern Newcastle Division for coal trains, gaining the number 20N. N stood for North, as the Northern Division was isolated from Sydney until the completion of the first Hawkesbury River Bridge in 1889. Apparently it came to be known as the Buck during the 1870s. This very historic locomotive is typical of short-haul freight locomotives used for coal haulage duties in the 1870s and appears to retain significant original features such as wooden brake blocks. Condemned by the New South Wales Government Railways in 1890, 20N was sold to J&A Brown in 1891 for use on their private colliery railways, where it became number 4 of the J&A Brown locomotive fleet and was used on the Hexham Minmi trains. Interestingly, J&A Brown was so impressed with the suitability of this locomotive when it worked on the New South Wales Railways, they had already ordered a repeat locomotive from Kitson, BUN 2236 of 1878, which became J&A Brown No. 3 and is today preserved by the Dorigo Steam Railway and Museum. In the following years, larger locomotives joined the J&A Brown fleet for coal haulage duties and No. 4 became a regular shunter of the coal staiths at Hexham. It was finally withdrawn in 1967 and set aside at Hexham. Withdrawal and preservation. Photographs of the Hexham sidings in the 1967 to 1973 period show lines of brown steam locomotives in storage, including number 3 and 4, Mersey Tank number 5 and the X-Rod 2-8-0S. In 1973 tenders were called for the sale and disposal of these locomotives, and railway preservationists rushed to save as many as possible. Fortunately, the New South Wales Rail Transport Museum stepped in to purchase 20N number 4 for preservation. It remained unrested and was placed on display at the Transport Museum at Thirlmere in 1975, faded black paint slowly giving way to rust ochre. In its early days of NSWRTM preservation, 20N number 4 carried the hand-painted name Sir Edward Warren on the saddle tanks. This name long intrigued me as it didn't seem to be historic, and Brian Robert Andrews finally provided an explanation in his authoritative work Coal, Railways and Mines, the story of the railways and collieries of J&A Brown as referenced below. Apparently Sir Edward Warren was the managing director of Coal and Allied Company at the time, and the name had been applied by an enthusiast in 1968 when the loco was stored at Hexham. Perhaps Sir Edward Warren had been sympathetic to preservation of the company's historic locos. In 1983 it was shunted onto the long-term storage sidings, away from public viewing. Static repainting and restoration of this historic locomotive by a small group of NSWRTM volunteers began in late 2004. At this time number 4 was moved into the exhibit shed where it was no longer subject to the elements. By 2008 de-rusting and repainting appeared substantially complete, with the locomotive painted unlined black with red side rods. Number 4 was transferred by rail to the Broadmeadow Roundhouse in August 2008 for storage during the New South Wales Rail Transport Museum upgrade. 20N is now a prime exhibit in the new Newcastle Museum, which is housed in the restored Honeysuckle Workshops on the Hunter River foreshore in downtown Newcastle. In preparation, 20N has been statically restored at the Hunter Valley Training Company, East Greta, and now presents to a high standard with nice features such as polished side rods. Unfortunately, the injector and some minor pipework appears to be missing. The display of this loco as a prime exhibit is a testament to NSW Rail Transport Museum's foresight in saving this locomotive back in 1973 and providing it many years of safe storage. Next is 1021, known as Cardiff. (1021) was built by Manning Wardle & Co., builders number 1896 of 1916, to one of their standard designs of industrial and construction locomotive, and was one of 5 similar locomotives imported by the New South Wales Public Works Department for various construction duties. 1021 finished its days with the New South Wales Government Railways in 1970 and fortunately was retained for the collection of the New South Wales Rail Transport Museum. 1021 was statically restored by volunteers in the early 1970s in an attractive lined blue livery, apparently representing the period when it was the Cardiff Workshop shunter. Unfortunately, this livery subsequently faded during the early years of open-air display at the NSWRTM Thirlmere site. During 2010, this locomotive was the beneficiary of restoration funding provided by Railcorp, and it received a thorough repaint and refurbishment in the new Thirlmere workshops. 1021 has since been placed on display within the theatrette of the new exhibition building at Thirlmere. Stephen Tolhurst also provides a complete history of locomotive 1021 on his excellent X10 website. 1021 is similar to Manning Wardle & Co. BN 1781 of 1911, which also survives in the collection of the Powerhouse Museum.